Hello and welcome back to Music Theory with Mr. Teachey. Today's lesson, we're going to talk about texture. Texture is basically the way in which different musical components fit together to form an overall sound. So when we talk about texture, we're typically talking about voices. And I'm not talking necessarily about the human voice. I could be talking about a melodic line played by an instrument. I could be talking about chords that are accompanying a piano player, so like the left hand chords and the right hand melody. I could be talking about all sorts of different musical elements. The thing I will not be talking about is unpitched percussion. When we're talking about texture in this context, we are typically ignoring unpitched instruments because we're mostly looking at how pitches interact with each other to form the different phonies. We'll call them phonies for now. There are 4 different texture types, and there are like some subtypes within each of these, but when we're talking about texture, we're typically going to end up deciding that the texture that we're hearing or seeing is one of these 4 different phonies. We got monophony, homophony, polyphony, and heterophony. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these. Monophony, you can tell by this root at the beginning of the word, mono. We're talking about one voice. If you have multiple singers, that can work as long as they are singing the same exact thing. They need to be in unison, or at most they can be doubled at the octave or something like that. So you don't have new pitches being introduced by new voices. You've got one unified melodic line here. So here is an example of monophony in the form of some Gregorian chant. Enjoy. So you might have noticed at the beginning we have just one singer singing one part, and then that singer is joined by several other singers, but they're all singing the same line. With homophony, we're talking about multiple voices, but they're unified in rhythm, or there's really like one primary melody and then the rest of the voices are accompanying that melody. So we've got 2 subtypes. We've got chordal homophony, and we've got a melody with accompaniment. So here's an example of chordal homophony in the form of a Bach chorale. So you will have noticed with this Bach chorale that we have multiple voices, but they are all united in their rhythm, except for a few minor exceptions, and they're working together within this larger context to form chords. Now let's listen to melody with accompaniment in the form of a Mozart piano sonata. Okay, so just in that little bit of that Mozart piano sonata, you heard a very prominent melody in the right hand. The left hand is not of major importance to the melody. It's really just there as a support or a foundation for the melody. So this would be homophony, even though you've got 2 voices doing 2 very different things rhythmically, because one of these voices is clearly not the melody, and is just supporting the melody, which is in the right hand. So when you're listening for homophony, you are listening for unified rhythm, or you're listening for one voice being of prime importance and then the other voice being sort of there as a support. Nobody would recognize this if they just heard the left hand of the piano, but if they heard just the right hand being played, they would know exactly what this was. So let's move along to polyphony. So with polyphony, you've got multiple voices, as you can tell from the root poly. We're talking about many voices. And the way this contrasts with homophony is these voices are independent. So this won't sound like chordal homophony because you've got independent voices doing their own thing. And this won't sound like melody with accompaniment because each of these voices is of equal importance and equal weight. So they're off doing their own thing, but they're each very important to the overall sound of the piece. With polyphony, you've got two different kinds. You've got non-imitative and you've got imitative. Imitative polyphony would sound like a fugue or a canon. There are these different forms where you're taking basically the same melody and chopping it up in different ways and using it to with itself. So you'll hear different voices performing the same melody or performing something that is derived from that same melody. Non-imitative polyphony sounds like a bunch of different voices really doing their own thing, not imitating each other at all. So this first example is more on the non-imitative side of things. It is a madrigal by Carlo Gesualdo. Now here's some imitative polyphony, the Canon in D by Johann Pachelbel. Finally, with heterophony, we're talking about multiple lines that are essentially the same line, but with ornamentation here and there in one part or another. Now, this is a form that is not all that common in Western art music, but you'll find it all the time in jazz and other improvisational forms, where they're taking a common melody, and depending on who's playing it and depending on when they're playing it, they're going to ornament it in different ways or depart and then return to the original melody in different ways. So let's hear some New Orleans jazz by a group called Tuba Skinny. Okay, so that is really just scratching the surface on these different texture types. I hope this has been at least a little bit helpful, but really this will not be enough. You got to do a lot of listening and a lot of critical listening, not just passive listening, to get it in your head, to be listening for these different voices, disentangling them, figuring out who's doing what, and then putting them back together to figure out what kind of texture you are listening to. So hope you've enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.